Mr. President, the American people have accused Washington and this chamber of being far too partisan, and they've been right. But I would venture to guess that we can reach a bipartisan agreement on the fact that our economy has taken a major hit over the last few years, a hit that I would argue we have yet to recover from. So here we are, debating another massive bill that is supposed to stave off another economic disaster. But does it really do that? I'm sure that most here are familiar with the children's tale of the boy who cried wolf far too often. The problem faced by this character was that when there really was an emergency, like the wolf verging on attack, there wasn't anyone around to take this alarm seriously. This is the path that we are heading down. The Senate is passing a massive bill after many other massive bills that we've passed and expanding the federal government to an unsustainable level, all in the name of avoiding another economic downturn. But what we're really doing here is setting our country up on a course that we cannot correct and creating unintended consequences that may ultimately rain more economic damage down on the American people. I think it's important to remind the American people why the government felt it necessary to use taxpayer dollars to bail out the GSEs, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. They did this because they claimed the two companies were, quote, too big to fail. The idea that the failure of two mortgage companies could bring down the whole U.S. economy was frightening to many, but confusing to many more. Make no mistake about it. This was a problem that the Congress created. Beginning in the 1990s, Congress decided to expand the goals of the Community Reinvestment Act by writing laws designed to encourage the GSEs, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, to meet certain affordable housing goals, giving Fannie and Freddie government permission to buy subprime home loans. This, of course, created an incentive for lenders to make more and more bad loans, since the GSEs would stand ready to buy them and take on the risk. And we now know, however, it is the American taxpayer that actually was taking on this risk. Before September 2008, few Americans realized that Fannie and Freddie had taken over the subprime market and were single-handedly making the dream of a home ownership a reality for thousands of Americans. But these Americans were realistically unable to afford the mortgages that Fannie and Freddie guaranteed. As home after home, neighborhood after neighborhood fell victim to the home foreclosure plague, Fannie and Freddie's losses started to greatly impact the U.S. economy, hence the notion of being too big to fail. Well, I've spent the last 2 years arguing that the government's interference in the situation with the taxpayer bailout was not the right move to make. By stepping in, blank taxpayer check in hand, the government set the American people up for bailout after bailout of Fannie and Freddie with no plan in place to reform these government-sponsored entities so that the taxpayer support would eventually end. Last Christmas, the Obama administration lifted its $400 billion limit to aid Fannie and Freddie. They just took the cap off. They pledged unlimited support through 2012. This is unlimited support for Fannie and Freddie. Can you imagine what that means? Mr. President, we don't have the funds to provide this kind of support. And the American people should not be on the hook for an indefinite blank check. And just this last month, while we were debating this bill on the floor, Fannie Mae asked for another $8.4 billion from the taxpayer. And Freddie has asked for an additional $10.6 billion from the taxpayer. Is the American taxpayer to assume that we will continue to fund their demands for more and more money every single time that they ask? What if this happens to be a monthly request for the next 2 years? The American taxpayer right now has no choice but to pay up. Simply put, I believe that this is ridiculous. Fannie and Freddie are referred to as government-sponsored entities because the wallets of the American people go straight into the bank accounts of these companies. The purpose of this financial reform bill before us should be to protect taxpayers against this concept known as too big to fail. But unfortunately, it does very little to address this issue. I offered an amendment on Fannie and Freddie to address the too big to fail issue with Fannie and Freddie. However, it was defeated mostly along party lines. My amendment would have protected the taxpayers from future bailouts of Fannie and Freddie by restricting their size so that they do not continue to be too big to fail. Fannie and Freddie remain large enough to threaten the stability of our economy in another economic downturn. My amendment would have limited their size to less than 3% of our GDP. But again, it was defeated mostly along party lines. If the government is arguing that we have to continue bailouts of Fannie and Freddie because they are too big to fail, shouldn't we be doing something to fix the internal problems of Fannie and Freddie? Senator McCain and Senator Shelby introduced an amendment to protect the taxpayers from Fannie and Freddie in their too big to fail state. But once again, their amendment was also defeated along party lines. Their amendment, of which I was a co-sponsor, would have meaningfully reformed these government-sponsored entities in an orderly fashion. It would have ended the government takeover of Fannie and Freddie within 3 years, would have provided more oversight to the companies, and would have eventually eliminated all government subsidies to Fannie and Freddie. This amendment was a thoughtful, clear-eyed approach to dealing with the two companies that drove my state of Nevada and our country into the housing foreclosure crisis. But again, this amendment was defeated along party lines. Instead of seeking meaningful reform of Fannie and Freddie through the financial reform bill, those on the other side of the aisle have decided that they will study the issue of Fannie and Freddie. They have asked the Treasury Department to make recommendations on these companies in 2011. In simple terms, this means we have punted or dealing with the risk of Fannie and Freddie, the risk that they pose to our economy for another year. And undoubtedly, more blank checks are on the way to Fannie and Freddie. By the time that the Democrats and the Treasury Department have further evaluated the risk, 30 months, 2.5 years, will have come and gone with taxpayers holding up these two companies with their hard-earned money. I believe that this is unacceptable, and frankly, it's unconscionable to ask hardworking taxpayers of this country to foot the bill for hundreds of billions of dollars of bailouts when Congress and the administration cannot even come up with a plan for Fannie and Freddie within 2.5 years of taking them over. Additionally, the bill before us creates this new Financial Stability Oversight Council that will have the authority to vote on which companies are, in their opinion, too big to fail. As we saw during the height of the financial crisis, the government, given the opportunity, is willing to arbitrarily select which companies can get government support and sponsorship. I believe this sets a dangerous precedent that will encourage large companies to take more unnecessary risks, since they will ultimately pay any losses associated with that risk onto the taxpayers' in the form of a bailout. Under the bill before us, the Financial Stability Oversight Council, under the guise of monitoring systemic risk to the financial system, will have the unintended consequences of encouraging more taxpayer bailouts. This is because the council has the authority to identify firms that would, and I quote, pose a threat to the financial stability of the United States. And it would place those firms under the Federal Reserve supervision. Now, the benefit of being placed under this exclusive list is that it comes with a market understanding that the U.S. government stands ready to keep the company afloat when it gets in trouble. This means that that company will have certain advantages over its competitors, including access to cheaper funds from the Fed. This will consolidate the market, enable the company to use the savings to take bigger and unnecessary risks. A regulatory structure that facilitates this kind of moral hazard does not work. Remember the boy who cried wolf that I was rehashing earlier? Well, the wolf came when confronted with the collapse of Fannie and Freddie and the government rushed in, no plan in hand to bail out these companies. And now we're sitting around debating legislation that does not even address the risk that they will pose in another economic downturn. We have to ask the question, do we honestly think that we're protecting ourselves from another too-big-to-fail bailout of Fannie and Freddie? This bill should have been our chance to protect the taxpayer and reform Fannie and Freddie, but we're ignoring this issue altogether and the systemic risk that follows with it. More simply put, we're ignoring the American people. The next time that the government cries wolf and steps in to bail out Fannie and Freddie again, the American people are going to be up in arms, as they should be. We're ignoring the American people at a time when they have joined together across this country to shout from every rooftop, mountaintop, and platform that they can find that they are done with bailouts. Unfortunately, Washington isn't listening. People in this body believe that we know better than the American people, and if the American people would just sit back and let us do our jobs, we'll figure all this out. Is this the reality? When Washington is in charge of something, we undoubtedly make a larger mess than what it was to begin with. But some of us just don't get it. Some don't get that the taxpayer should not be on the hook for bailing out the financial industry when there is a proper course of action for companies that are struggling to pay their debts. It's called bankruptcy. Wouldn't you agree that if the bankruptcy process is good enough for Main Street, it should be good enough for Wall Street? When the automakers were struggling with economic downturn, I argued that they should utilize the orderly bankruptcy process to reorganize. But the government thought that it knew better and decided to bail them out. Then the government decided who the winners and losers would be in that process instead of following the rule of law. The same has happened with the financial industry. Instead of declaring bankruptcy, the financial giants waited for the government to step in and lend them an American taxpayer hand. The executives that drove these companies into the ground when the bailout came are those same executives who later received huge bonuses. Does this make sense to anybody? Moving forward, this needs to end. But this bill does not do that. Under this bill, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, would have expanded authority to take over, manage, and liquidate troubled financial companies. The FDIC would take over the assets and operate the financial company with all the powers of management, directors, and shareholders. In that way, the government acting through the FDIC will continue to determine which companies continue and which do not. This bill would essentially institutionalize the kind of bailouts that have occurred during the recent crisis. Rather than providing an alternative to policy of bailouts, it would permanently establish a policy of too big to fail. Second, the expanded resolution authority would be operated with a considerable degree of discretion about when to start the intervention and about the priority to give to different creditors. People talk about the impact of Lehman Brothers' sudden collapse on sparking a market panic. And the authors of this bill seem to think that the answer is to create a system to prop up future banks. It was not the collapse, but rather the surprise involvement and then abandonment by the government that created market turmoil. Do you understand why one bank might be bailed out, but another would be left to collapse? It was all done behind closed doors. The better lesson learned from this crisis is that we need to have a predictable, rule-based bankruptcy process rather than an expanded discretionary resolution authority. These bailouts do not incentivize these institutions to minimize the risk. Instead, they go as far as to privatize the profits of these institutions while socializing the risk. In other words, putting that risk onto the taxpayer. Senator Sessions from Alabama introduced an amendment that I co-sponsored to offer hardworking American families a reprieve from footing this bill of another financial sector bailout, while also discouraging these companies from continuing the irresponsible practices that got them into trouble in the first place. Again, this amendment was defeated largely along party lines. The amendment would have made these companies utilize an enhanced bankruptcy process to ensure that the costs are covered by the financial institutions themselves and their creditors, not the taxpayer. Additionally, it would have created a new Chapter 14 in the Bankruptcy Code that would utilize many of the tenets of Chapter 11 bankruptcy. This is where companies reorganize. But it would have been for the specific use of these large financial institutions. This addition to the Bankruptcy Code would have created a new pathway to limit the cascading spread of risk and panic through the financial system and assured the more orderly wind down of these big financial institutions, insulated from bailouts and political influence. Senator Sessions' amendment would have delivered much-needed transparency, accountability, stability, and due process through the use of bankruptcy courts. Further, to protect the taxpayers, it specifically denied the federal government the authority to take over these firms, dictate the terms of their reorganization or liquidation, and support them with federal bailouts. It protected the taxpayer. The amendment guaranteed real reform that would have resulted in real stability. Unfortunately, the Democrats decided to go in a different direction, one that moves away from protecting the taxpayer, and swiftly defeated this bankruptcy amendment. So what does that mean for the average American? It means that this financial reform bill does not end this concept of too big to fail, and it ensures that more taxpayer bailouts will occur with the next financial crisis that we have in America. In fact, this legislation goes as far as to create unnecessary and burdensome regulatory requirements that will ultimately hurt small businesses. Nowhere is this clearer than in the creation of the new Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. This new huge government bureaucracy will have the authority to write and enforce rules that could ultimately tighten the availability of credit, could discourage business investment at a time when we can least afford it. I'm deeply concerned about the jurisdictional reach of this new bureaucracy. I was pleased that the Senate, however, adopted an amendment that I offered last night that would exempt from the new agency all sellers of non-financial goods that give customers the options of making installment payments. At a time when the economy has taken its toll on many American families and small businesses, it is vital that businesses are not discouraged from offering their customers these flexible payment options. This is a classic overreach by Washington, and I'm glad that my colleagues narrowed the scope of this agency a little bit so that we don't further stunt our country's economic growth. However, my amendment fixes just one problem with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, this large bureaucracy. This bureau has no oversight and has access to billions of dollars from the Federal Reserve. We've seen too often bureaucracies grow and grow in the normal process. That's just simply what bureaucracies do. Can you imagine what kind of monstrosity this bureaucracy can grow to with no oversight and no limit to the type of funding that it can receive? So I ask you, do you feel like we're really reforming this financial industry with the legislation before the U.S. Senate? The purpose of my speech today was to highlight all that is wrong, or at least some that is wrong, with the bill that we have before us. But I ran into the problem when doing this because what's wrong with this bill is literally almost the entire bill. I point out the issues of Fannie and Freddie, bailouts versus bankruptcy, because had those amendments been offered to this legislation, they would have been the sole examples of what is right with the financial reform bill. Unfortunately, they were not adopted. And the American people are tired, and frankly, so am I. I'm tired of standing up to speak about real reform, all the while watching as my colleagues pass massive pieces of legislation through this body as solutions looking for a problem, while continuing to ignore that we have real problems in need of real solutions. This financial reform bill does nothing to address the real problem of the financial industry, but it does ensure that taxpayers guarantee the bad debt of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and ensures that too big to fail will continue. Why else would Goldman Sachs be supporting this bill? Just as these companies guaranteed bad debt that eventually brought them to their knees. Is that what we're waiting for? At the rate we're going, unfortunately, I believe this could become a reality. The economic issues plaguing Greece aren't just a scary thing to watch unfold on television. It could be the future of our country, the great United States of America, if we don't start shaping up. And it's up to this body, the president, and the body on the other side of the Capitol to do that. Rushing legislation through Congress and into law doesn't mean that we're addressing pressing issues. It means that we're passing time and passing unintended consequences onto the taxpayer. We're passing time that we don't have, using money that we don't have, and doing so in a country that can't afford another bailout, another collapse of another too big to fail company. Mr. President, I yield the floor.